If you haven't seen part 1 of this video, I suggest that you see part 1 before watching part 2. So to continue our narrative of why Revelations 12 and Revelations 20 is contradictory and a false prophecy, we now have to understand that through the eyes of the Hellenistic Jewish writer of Revelations, that he was not seeing the world in the same way that people see the world today, and how these verses have been modernized because of the false prophecy. We established earlier in chapter 1, or in part 1 of this video, of how Revelations 12 places the war in heaven based on utilizing the text of the book of Enoch and the ideas of Enoch happening between Genesis chapter 1, verse 1 and 2. And that a third of the angels were swept down, where Enoch only says 200 angels came down. This is a clear indication of how they utilize the story of the first story. We saw that in telling that story, how it had a contradiction as far as this devil not having a place on the earth, and identifying the great dragon as the devil and Satan, but he didn't have a place on earth. But yet we saw that he is up there with Job. So before we get into chapter 20 of Revelations, we have to understand that the beast is not the devil, that the beast is Emperor Nero. As I said on the very end of the previous video, the numbering of Nero Caesar's name in the Aramaic is the number 666, and in the Latin it is 616. Now, what they expected was for Nero in the late first century, early second century, was for Nero to return, and in his return that he would persecute Christians, and that during that time frame we have a false prophecy of Jesus saying that he would return before those who were alive in that day, in that time, would die. He would return. So in their mind, what's going to happen in verse 20 is something that was going to happen towards the latter end of the first century CE into the early parts of the second century CE. So this is what's going to make this into a false prophecy. Because chapter 20 of Revelation starts out by saying that the angel of the Lord came down holding the keys to the bottomless pit and the great chain. He sees the dragon, the ancient serpent, who is the devil and Satan, and bound him for 1,000 years. So in their mindset, Jesus was going to come down during this great tribulation that the Christians were facing during this time frame of Nero ruling the Roman Empire again and persecuting Christians, causing them to either worship him in the imperial cult or to be beheaded, to be kicked out of the economic system, for them to be in a state of dread as described in the Bible as far as what the beast is doing. All those chapters in between 12 and 20 are describing the beast. They're not describing the devil or the Satan. The devil and the Satan have been had been the rulers of the air and the rulers of the world, and is ruling this Antichrist, but yet it is not the Antichrist himself. So in Revelations 20, it's saying that Jesus is going to come down, and the Satan was going to be cast into this pit and locked down for 1,000 years. This is the millennial reign, with their expectation of it happening around the end of the first century, beginning of the second century. This will put that the millennial reign went from late first century CE all the way for 1,000 years, which will place it in around the 11th century CE. Did this ever happen? No, it did not. During this time frame, we saw more war. We saw more. We saw the rise of Islam. We saw slavery increase. We saw the treatment of people and women's rights being eroded even more so. We saw more decimation going on during these time frames than we saw prior to it, than what we saw in the first century. So this millennial reign of Jesus and the Satan and the devil being locked away and all this peaceful things happening never happened. So the child that is referred to in Revelations 12 did not descend and rule with an iron scepter. The throne of David did not maintain a seat on it. A seed of the throne of David did not sit on the throne as it is described in the Old Testament. The Levitical priests were not given their abilities to um, sacrifice animals. And those who followed the commandments of God, although if you look country to country, you will see some persecution, but they were not worldwidely persecuted during that time frame. So the 1,000-year reign never happened. And at the end of this 1,000-year reign, the Satan character will be released again. Now, there are some theologians and some crackpots out there who said that there was a millennial reign, there was a time frame, and that no one knows about it. The history was not recorded, that there's a gap of 1,000 years within our knowledge of what was happening on earth. And that the history that we do have is them picking up after the 1,000-year reign. But unfortunately, historical documentation, coinage, pottery, the existence of cities, the growth of nations, the defeat of the Roman Empire, the European countries becoming what they became, the growth of Islam, all these things are easily recorded and easily identified as happening. And that there is no gap of time where there was this millennial reign. Because according to Revelations 20, after this millennial reign, the Satan is then released out of his prison. And he came out to deceive the nations again, and just said, nations of all four corners of the earth, Gog and Magog, in order to gather them for battle, and the numbers of the sands of the sea, that they all came out. And that is the time frame that we're living in now, according to them. That 1,000-year reign was the first judgment. And that it was great if you lived during that time frame of the first judgment. And then it is after this war on the earth that happens, that people are waiting for now, that this will be the second death, the second judgment. So what you have is the modernization of the Bible in order to make it fit, because what really was expected to happen by the believers of the Bible, the believers of Jesus, I should say, during the first century and early second century, is that all these things would happen in their time frame. And that we would, that our time frame should be a time frame where the 1,000-year reign has happened, and now we are living in that time frame where the devil has reigned for a while, and then we are waiting for a third return of Jesus, so that the final judgment and the final death can happen. But because there is absolutely zero evidence of this, we know that this is just what the perceived idea of a late first century or early second century writer named John, whether it was John the Elder, John of Patmos, was sitting in a jail cell having a delusional dream or vision, and thought what would occur because Jesus had made this false prophecy that he would return before those people would die. And so he imagined this 1,000-year reign of peace and love and tranquility for those who kept his commandments, and that there would be no Satan who had power over the earth and power over the air. And after this 1,000-year reign, the Satan will be let loose, and then we will all go back, and then there will be a final judgment. This is why his book of Revelations actually ends soon after he has this vision of the new earth and the new Jerusalem. Uh, and then finally, he concludes it in Revelations 22 with the river of life and the trees of life, and all these sorts of beautiful, wonderful things that people are expecting to have for the final living in heaven with this God. But we see that none of those things happen. And it's just another false prophecy. And it's just another failed attempt to spread a religion based on the persecution that they were feeling at that time frame and what their expectations were for a new Messiah of their time frame. Has absolutely nothing to do with us, which is why the Bible should have absolutely nothing to do with us. So always remember, you have to free yourself to be yourself, because your greatness is non-negotiable. Good journey, good vibrations.